agenda, we have a slight change this evening. We're going to have the public comment period at the end. So we want to make sure that all the members of the public are aware, and if you have a comment that you'd like to submit during the meeting, we do have written comment forms that you can fill out and then provide them to Cody right here or any Air District staff. We're also going to be moving part of one agenda item. Number 6 is going to be moved up so that we can present the subcommittee recommendations from the meeting last week, and that will happen after item number 3. So with that, I'd like to introduce Heather Bolstad from the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and she's going to make a presentation on the health effects of air contaminants.
Hello. Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm Heather, like Jessica said, and I'm a toxicologist with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, which is one of the components of the California Environmental Protection Agency. The other components are the Air Resources Board, Cal Recycle, the Department of Pesticide Regulation, Department of Toxic Substances Control, and the State Water Resources Control Board. The California EPA's headquarters are in this building in Sacramento, but OEHA also has an office here in Oakland, and that's where I am. So I just wanted to put up Cal EPA's mission and OEHA's mission here, but it's really to enhance and protect the health of Californians as well as the environment in California. Oops. So today, I just want to talk a little bit about what risk is, what toxicity is, also exposure, how my department determines toxicity and factors that influence toxicity, how we determine what we call health guidance values for use in estimating risk, and then some of the health concerns associated with the chemicals that are going to be measured here, how risk is determined from the data, and then how does improving air quality affect health? So first, risk is a function of toxicity and exposure. And toxicity reflects how dangerous a chemical is. So water we wouldn't consider very dangerous. But if you drink enough of it, it is toxic. And we use health guidance values as a kind of metric or measurement that reflects how toxic something is. In terms of exposure, does the chemical contact or enter our body? And in this case, the exposure information will come from the air monitoring data because that's the actual concentration that people in the community are breathing in on a daily basis. So this slide just shows some photos of different routes of what we would call inhalation exposure. So exposure via the respiratory route. And we'll get into more of these sources later, such as diesel exhaust and smoke and particulate matter in general. So how do we determine the toxicity of a chemical? So like I mentioned, OEHA develops benchmarks for toxicity called health guidance values. And we have two kinds. One is for non-cancer effects, and these are called RELs, or reference exposure levels. And those are the levels that we anticipate will not have any risk for non-cancer health effects, even in sensitive populations like children and pregnant women. So they're designed to protect everyone. For cancer, we use unit risks or cancer potency factors to describe how potent a carcinogen is. And it's essentially a unit that describes the increase in cancer risk per unit of exposure. Like if you were exposed to 1 milligram per cubic meter of a certain carcinogen, what would your increased cancer risk be per milligram per meter cubed? So there are a number of things that influence toxicity. So obviously the amount. although that's not simple either. Like for vitamins, at low levels, you have deficiency. At high levels, there can be toxicity. Some chemicals are like that too, in terms of having a U-shaped dose-response curve. But anyway, that's more complicated than we can get into today. But length of exposure, that's important too. And then sensitivity. So we all vary, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But different people have different vulnerability factors, and we take that into account when we're considering risk. So another key point that can influence toxicity is the fact that as dose increases, the effect is not necessarily going to stay the same. So alcohol is a great example of this. So at a low amount of alcohol consumption, according to this figure, there's giddiness and then sleep, deep sleep, and then eventually you die. So the type of effect changes as the dose increases. So it's not just giddiness up through, 20 shots. Toxicity also depends on the amount of time someone is exposed. So this figure, I don't know why someone's throwing a bag of grain on this guy, but it's a great figure to illustrate what we call the dose rate concept. So this would hurt when it's thrown on you all at once. But if the same bag was opened and the grain dropped on you little by little over time, probably wouldn't hurt. You could probably take it. So this reflects how toxicity is influenced by exposure time. And we actually come up with values for different exposure times. So for brief, what we call acute exposures, which are occasional 1-hour exposures, we develop acute RELs. For moderate exposure, we develop what we call 8-hour RELs, which are protective for 8-hour exposures over a significant fraction of the lifetime. So this could be a child attending school 8-ish hours a day, someone working 8-ish hours a day over a good part of their lifetime. And then constant exposure we use chronic RELs for. And so these exposures are from 1 year to a lifetime. So living in a community with constant exposure to various contaminants in the air would be considered chronic exposure. And then in terms of sensitivity, more people are affected as the amount of chemical they're exposed to increases. So this figure, which I think refers more to something infectious, but just bear with me, at a small amount of exposure, this first person starts to have some respiratory symptoms. As it increases, individuals 2, 3, and then all of a sudden 4 are impacted. And 4 is bedridden due to this. So this person's especially sensitive. And then as you increase the amount of exposure, more and more people are affected. But this individual is still not affected, and so they would be considered resistant. So the point is that people differ. Some are more sensitive than others, like children and pregnant women and the elderly and those with chronic respiratory and heart disease, and others can be more resistant. Okay, so how do we develop health guidance values? So it's a process, which hopefully I'll make clear. So we review all the available health effects information on the compound. And this can be from animals, it can be epidemiology studies in humans. Even today, we're getting information now from studies done in a petri dish, what we call in vitro studies. And we try to identify what is the most sensitive effect. What is the effect that takes the smallest amount of exposure to cause? Because that's what we want to protect against. So then we determine the relationship between the amount of chemical and the effect. So that is what we call the dose-response relationship. So is it really steep, which would be very concerning? Or is it more gradual? Is there a threshold? And then when we determine the amount that causes a specific effect, for example, a 10% decrease in body weight, And for many of us, a 10% decrease in body weight would be great. But in animal studies, we consider a 10% decrease in body weight to be an adverse effect. Another example would be, say, 10% drop in an immune parameter, or a 5% increase in excess cancer risk, something like that. So we figure out the dose that corresponds to that effect. And then we adjust it for the route for which species it was tested in. Like rats and mice are what we call obligate nose breathers. They only breathe through their nose, whereas we often breathe through our mouths. So their exposure to their respiratory tract is going to be different from ours, and we have to take that into account if the information came from a rodent. And then also, a lot of studies that we may use don't actually last the 2 years of a rodent's life, for example. If it's only 3 months, then we need to adjust it to protect humans from, for example, chronic exposure. And then we also need to adjust for other things. Time differences, like a lot of animal inhalation studies are for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. But we're exposed 7 days a week if it's a chronic situation. So we have to adjust for that. And then also, if there's missing information, if there isn't a study on developmental toxicity, that's a concern. We consider that a database gap, and we will add more uncertainty factors to adjust for that missing information. And then again, other adjustments for species. And then also adjustments for differences in sensitivity between people. And then finally, we get the health guidance value. So I'll go through just a very simple example. So let's say 1,000 parts per billion, which is a unit for measuring air concentration, in the rat caused your specific effect of interest, say 10% drop in body weight. That was the most sensitive effect. You divide by 10 after determining what do we know about how sensitive the rat is versus the human in general, but also for this chemical. And so we use a factor of 10 because we anticipate humans to be more sensitive. There's also very complex adjustments for the shape of the respiratory tract, our respiratory tract versus a rodent, that sort of thing. So for this hypothetical chemical, we didn't have a developmental study. So we're going to add a factor of 10 to try to protect against any potential developmental effects that we aren't aware of. And then because asthmatic children may be more sensitive to this compound, we'll add another factor of 10. So ultimately, dividing by 10 3 times, we get to 1 ppb. So that would be our health guidance value. So I want to talk a bit about particulate matter. And this figure is often used to show scale. So if this is a human hair, it's about 50 to 70 what we call microns in diameter. A micron is a millionth of a meter. And beach sand is about 90 microns, so a little thicker. So dust, pollen, and mold are about what we would call PM10, or particulate matter that's 10 microns or less in diameter. And then even smaller than that is PM2.5. So these are the tiny red dots here, so very small compared to the width of a human hair. And these include combustion particles, organic compounds, metals, etc. And so these are particulate matter that is 2.5 microns and less in diameter. So why is that important? Well, it influences toxicity. So not only does the size matter, but what's in it, and we'll talk more about what's in the particulate matter in a bit. But in terms of size, PM2.5 can reach deep into the lung. So this figure kind of illustrates that. So particulate matter that's greater than 10 microns it's not considered respirable. So it may lodge in your nose, but that's largely it. And then you'll sneeze it out or cough it out or something like that. PM 2.5 to 10 will reach deeper, these yellow dots. And then PM 2.5 will make it down into the lungs, and around PM1 and less, especially PM.1, will make it really deep to the air exchange region of the lungs. So some of the health concerns with short-term exposure to particulate matter, especially PM2.5 in particular, include respiratory irritation, decreased lung function, asthma attacks, and other respiratory and cardiovascular symptoms. And both short and long-term exposure have been associated with really severe effects, including premature death, cardiovascular mortality and hospitalizations, as well as hospitalizations due to respiratory and asthma conditions. So sensitive populations, very similar to what I've already discussed. The elderly, those with chronic heart and lung conditions, or asthma, emphysema, for example, infants and children, and they can have increased incidences of childhood illness because of exposure and decreased lung function. And then also pregnant women. Exposure during pregnancy has been associated with decreased birth weight and then also premature birth or preterm birth. So diesel exhaust contributes to particulate matter. So it's kind of a type of particulate matter. So in terms of non-cancer effects, these are very similar just to PM in general. So a lot of what we know actually about diesel exhaust comes from what we know about particulate matter. So respiratory effects, hospitalizations, sensitive populations, essentially the same as for particulate matter. Cancer. Diesel exhaust is known to increase cancer risk. And the California Air Resources Board, CARB, estimates that about 70% of your average Californian's cancer risk is from diesel exhaust. Cancer risk from air pollution specifically. But this is going down, thankfully, because the diesel exhaust levels in California are going down as well. So our health guidance values for diesel exhaust for non-cancer, our chronic REL is 5 micrograms per meter cubed. And this was derived based on changes observed in the rat lung. For cancer, the unit risk is 0.0003 cases of cancer per microgram per meter cubed. And then the inhalation potency factor is another way to describe it. And this was based on lung tumors in workers. So the observations of lung cancer in humans. So I want to talk a bit about wood smoke, which I know is an issue, especially in the winter. So wood smoke contains thousands of chemicals, but the most concerning are the particulate matter in smoke, both the PM10 and the PM2.5, carbon monoxide, irritants, and these include aldehydes like acrolein and formaldehyde. And these may trigger asthma attacks. And then there are also carcinogens, including what we call polyaromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. Also benzene, 1,3-butadiene, and formaldehyde is also a carcinogen. And interestingly, the wood smoke in the air, for example, during the winter, infiltrates into homes. So it contributes to indoor air pollution as well as outdoor air pollution. So if you're burning in your home, the fireplace contributes to indoor air pollution, but the outside smoke also will contribute. And there's this study by the Air Resources Board, which looked at the air district's program of requiring reductions in residential fireplace burning during days where the air quality was forecast to be poor. And they found that this program decreased particulate matter levels and decreased hospitalizations for cardiovascular disease. So that's kind of proof of concept and just shows how important it is. And this happened here due to the Air District's efforts. So in terms of the health concerns of some metals of interest, Some of these concerns are shown here, and they affect different organs. Lung cancer is a big one, adrenal cancer, kidney cancer, and again, this is through the respiratory route, and these are the most sensitive effects for these compounds, because each compound can have numerous effects. But our RELs and unit risks for cancer are based on these endpoints. So the nervous system, pretty much any system will be affected by some compound. For volatile organic compounds, which are compounds that are in the gas phase at what we call ambient temperature and pressure, which we're all sitting in. So they're gas phase compounds that contain carbon. So that's why they're called volatile and organic compounds, so VOCs. And you might hear also SVOCs, semi-volatile. And some of their impacts are shown here. Again, these nasal tumors tend to come from rat studies, because again, they only breathe through their nose. So in the human, it may be something like a deeper lung tumor, not a nasal tumor, that's the concern. But whatever we see in animals, for the most part, we assume is going to happen in humans, and we need to protect for it. And the other systems are also impacted by various compounds. So how do we determine the risk from the amount measured in air? So for non-cancer, it's pretty simple. Is the amount in the air greater or less than the reference exposure level? If it's greater, there may be some concern. But thankfully, we've incorporated, as you saw, 3 factors of 10 to try to protect against any uncertainty or error or variability. If it's lower, we have less concern. For cancer, it's a little more complicated. So how much does the amount in the air increase the risk by? If it's higher, there's some concern, and the level of concern will depend on how much higher. If it's lower, there'll be less concern. So in terms of the benefits of improving air quality and reducing particulate matter exposures, there have been a number of studies that just show how important it is and that it has real observable effects. So an example in the Utah Valley is that when a steel mill shut down, there was reduced particulate matter and also reduced respiratory hospital admissions. In Ireland, a ban on coal sales reduced particulate matter and death from heart and lung disease. In Southern California, they found that children who moved to less polluted areas had improved lung function growth because particulate matter can slow lung function growth in children, and those who moved to more polluted areas had decreased growth rates. A review of cardiovascular mortality and particulate matter in 51 metro areas across the US found that as particulate matter levels were reduced over the years, life expectancy increased. And then just in general, because diesel particulate matter is a carcinogen, as diesel exhaust particulate matter decreases, the associated cancer risk will also decrease. And I just wanted to show you, so this is from, this is a chart showing down here years between 2000 and 2017. And here, the number of days Fresno Air Monitoring Station measured particulate matter 2.5 levels above the standard. So it's not the actual measured value, it's the number of days in a year that were above the 2006 PM 2.5 standard. And I just wanted to show you, and this is the closest monitoring station that I could find to South Central Fresno. It's just outside it at Hamilton and Winery. And you can see that the levels of PM 2.5 have gone down because the number of days in exceedance of the standard have gone down. So when looking only at this, there would be some anticipated health benefits because of that decrease. And that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions. Feel free to contact me. Yeah, question?
Hi, sorry, we need to talk into the microphone. And we do have 10 minutes allocated for questions, but if you have additional questions too, you can talk to Heather after the meeting.
It took a minute for me.
I'll just speak very loudly. It's not working.
Wait, is it, it sounds like it's working, sorry, for
Now
the
it's working.
translators. There
Okay.
you go.
The last slide, that one that you showed, you mentioned a particular PM 2.5 standard. What year again was that standard?
This plot shows the levels that exceeded the 2006
The
standard.
2006 standard. Okay, and my second question is, what was that standard? How many micrograms per cubic meter, or what was the parts per billion? What was that standard?
You know, I don't remember. This is pulled from CARB's website.
Right.
You can look for trends over time, and I don't recall because it changed in 2013, right? Yeah, okay.
Per cubic
Thank you.
meter? Okay, thank you.
And just so you know, we're going to have public.
Hi, Heather. So just a quick question, just so everybody can understand where these things come from. So you mentioned on VOCs, just generally this list of VOCs, you see a lot of benzene, a lot of toluene, but what industry would they normally be associated? Where would we see these emissions happening the most?
For the VOCs, well, they're present in exhaust, so combustion
So
sources.
say I'm in Kern County, where would I find them the most?
You mean in terms of the air?
Yeah, where would they come from?
Well, there could be stationary sources, but also the mobile sources.
So would you think the oil and gas industry probably have a lot of VOCs associated with them?
The oil and gas industry has been associated with higher levels of benzene close by, ethyl benzene, a number of compounds.
So yes, and
Yeah.
then auto combustion engines, period, like diesel and
Yeah.
car engines.
Yeah.
Just saying, a lot of the chemicals that you named are pretty foreign to most people. Most of us don't think about that. But the VOCs generally is something the Air District talks about a lot. So knowing where they form ozone and PM 2.5 depending. So I think
Yeah.
knowing where they come. What about pesticides? Are they associated with some pesticides as well?
Well, some pesticides could be considered volatile organic compounds or just volatile.
So that's where folks might find them in their community, so they would know,
Yes.
where that's happening. And then you mentioned a lot of metals on the other page. So again, is there any idea where we would find things like arsenic in our environment?
Yeah, arsenic is actually naturally occurring in the soil. Like, I used to live in Davis. The levels in the Davis water are naturally high. It can also come from, various mining operations. It's also, because it's naturally in the Earth's crust, it's going to be in fossil fuels.
So even in PM10, the dust could be in the dust from the soil, and even though it's not, as you pointed out, respirable, gets in your mouth and
Yeah.
your nose, it's entering your body system.
You could potentially have some oral
swallow
exposure.
it. If you swallow it enough, it could be problematic.
Well, and children also have what we call hand-to-mouth behavior,
There you
which
go.
is just a technical term for they put their fingers in their mouth and put everything else in their mouth. So they consume a lot of dust that you and I would just breathe, but they're eating it, and they also have dermal exposure.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and one thing you mentioned, it's less of an issue, I think, here because there are so many sources of PM and VOCs, but I did just listen to someone present on a study where as air quality has improved in terms of car emissions, the importance of VOC emissions from personal care products has increased. So it's kind of, this. Yes, but, using hairspray in your house is also going to contribute to outdoor pollution, just as outdoor pollution contributes to indoor pollution.
Ooh, it's on. Go back to wood smoke. You mentioned that it's primarily addressed to wood burning stoves. it would also be possible for this source in the summertime to be from wildfires?
Sorry, would one of the sources be wildfires?
Yeah.
For sure. And that's how we know about some of these effects. But there have also been studies, I think one of them was in California, that measured different VOC levels in homes that had wood stoves, fireplaces, gas heat, no source of VOCs, et cetera. And there were some increases in the PAH levels in the homes due to the wood combustion sources, but they also found that like I mentioned, the outside wood smoke pollution was infiltrating. So yes, this would also apply to wildfire smoke, but in a wildfire, if homes are also burning, that's going to contribute a whole host of other different compounds.
I understand that there's ongoing health studies showing that the PM 2.5 can enter the lungs and go through the lining of the lungs to the bloodstream and therefore directly to the brain.
Not necessarily to the brain through the blood because of the blood-brain barrier, but through the nose. So the olfactory bulb, the neurons end right here. So what you inhale can go what we call retrograde fashion up to the brain that way. So very small particles, maybe nanoparticles, can potentially do that. I think it's less of a concern breathing into the blood, the particles to the brain, but the particles do get in the blood, but thankfully the blood-brain barrier should filter larger ones out.
But they can go through the lining of the lungs and into the bloodstream therefore.
Yeah,
And I understand
especially the smallest ones, like PM1.
you know, there's a study going, I understand, I don't know, in Southern California that said that it's maybe a cause of Alzheimer's. They don't say maybe, they're pretty certain.
You said they're pretty sure about it?
Yeah.
Potentially. I think Alzheimer's is a multifactorial disease. They're still finding out multiple causes, but yeah, that'll be interesting to see. Anything else?
Yes, thank you for your information. It was very informative. I kind of have two questions. One is about the campfire. We got a lot of smoke, and I'm wondering, has there been any studies, health studies, or will there be any health studies on the long-term effect of that fire, since not only was it wood, but also toxics because so many of the homes went up? And,
Yeah.
you know, you had human remains that also was up in the air and, you know,
Pardon, what was up in the air?
human remains,
Oh.
because people died in that fire,
Right.
so you would assume, you know, they were automatically cremated and they hit the air stream. The other question I have, is there any studies or data on the effect of the 3 highways in our study area that we can look at?
In terms of the 3 highways, I'm not aware of any. I could look into it. I know there are many studies just in general showing increased exposure levels and increased risk for health effects the closer one lives to a freeway. And I know CARB is looking into that as well, and trying to estimate emissions based on what kind of cars are on the road. So I could look into that. I wouldn't be surprised if there are studies locally. But that would potentially require some modeling to determine, because, you know, the pollution from one highway doesn't just stay right above it, right? It's mixing all over here. So, and then regarding the campfire, my colleagues are actually doing studies on whether there were immediate impacts on health from the fire, you know, one day, several days after. And then as we're farther and farther away in time, they'll be looking also at the long-term impacts. So, yeah, it's a good question. And that smoke was pretty awful. You know, the Bay Area where I live had the worst air quality in the world at that time because the plume just went over the Bay Area. And you could just tell that it wasn't just wildfire that burned. I mean, same thing with Sonoma fires. It didn't just smell like trees, it smelled like synthetics were burning.
Amy, last question.
Have you done any analysis of cumulative health impacts of all these toxics? I mean, you kind of describe by, you know, bucket, but cumulative health impacts, because if people are living here, they're breathing all of that combined. So what has been your analysis of that, if any?
So that would be the end goal, once this information is collected, would be to do a community health risk assessment, which would determine the cumulative impacts. And we have methods to do that. For non-cancer, it's kind of like we're adding ratios. So let's say your exposure levels are higher than the reference exposure level for many different chemicals, and they all affect the respiratory tract. That would then mean there's a substantial amount of risk that the air pollution is causing respiratory problems. For cancer, we also, in a way, add together cancer risk to determine a cumulative cancer risk. Because you're not only exposed to benzene, right? You're exposed to multiple things. And there are community assessments in general. It's really hard to determine every single compound that's in the air and at what time, what amount, how it varies, all of that. But we can also look at disease numbers, you know, in communities and see how different interventions affect health. Like I mentioned, you know, one mill shutting down can improve air quality, and you can see it in the number of hospital admissions. So that's a great question.
All right, well, thank you so much, Heather, for being here. And as I mentioned, you'll be available to answer questions. So next, we're going to move the first part of agenda item 6 up. As many of you know, we had a subcommittee meeting last week, and several of you volunteered to help identify recommendations for monitoring locations. And Genevieve Gale and Larry Taylor are going to present those recommendations to you now.
All right, good evening, everybody. I'm John Klassen. I'm the Director of Strategies and Incentives at the Air District, and I'm up here with Genevieve, and Larry's going to come up here as well to join us. Come on up. So we're here to give the full committee here a quick overview of what was discussed at the air monitoring subcommittee meeting that we had last week. So let me just give you a brief overview. So last month we talked about air monitoring in quite a bit of detail. Had a really good discussion, got a lot of good feedback from everybody. That conversation was so extensive that the committee wanted a subcommittee to be formed to dive into the details and go into it even deeper to get some recommendations. So we were able to form that subcommittee. After that April 10th meeting, we had that subcommittee meeting just last week, last Wednesday. We had a subgroup of this group here come. We went through an exercise, had some really good discussions, and Genevieve and Larry are going to give some more details of what we did in that exercise together. And the work that we did there is really going to help us focus on the design of our air monitoring network for the South Central Fresno community. And you saw this when I discussed this last month with you, just a quick breakdown of the air monitoring stations we already have here in the area: Fresno Pacific, Fresno Foundry, Fresno Drummond, and the pollutants that they measure. You have that as your reference. So a lot of work is already being done in the area. This monitoring will continue throughout this entire process, and these are permanent monitors. They're already a part of our permanent monitoring network. They're not going to be moving. It's very difficult to move these immobile structures from one place to another. And this data is going to really provide us a good foundation for what we're going to add to it with our community-based network. We looked at this as well last month, but we went over this again with the subcommittee, looking at all of the types of equipment we have available for the area down here, the types of platforms we have to work with, an air monitoring trailer, compact air monitoring systems, standalone PM 2.5 analyzers, and a mobile air monitoring van, and all the capabilities we're able to do. I just wanted to note as well that we've already purchased all this equipment. This is what we're going to have to work with starting this summer. This equipment takes a long time to procure and get into place, so we had to make the order last year to make sure we had it ready for this summer. But if we get more resources to do more monitoring, we can do different things, different types of equipment. We want that feedback as well, and we can do some different things as we go forward. But this is what we have to work with to start. And just a few last notes. We talked about this a bit last month as well, but all the equipment that we're going to be using for South Central Fresno, this is high precision regulatory grade equipment. It's all very similar to what we use at our regulatory air monitoring stations. A lot of the models are the exact same models we use at the station, so this is the best, most accurate data that we can collect. We want that to be a real key for this network. And this equipment that we're going to have is going to be more mobile. We can deploy it quicker than our fixed stations. We can move things around more easily. It's going to be much more flexible, which is going to be a great tool for us. And we talked a bit about the Fresno Garland Air Monitoring Station at the last meeting. That's definitely a very capable site here in the Fresno area. It's just north of the boundary of the area here. That site can do a lot of things, but the equipment that we're going to be operating can also do a lot of things and can do almost everything Fresno Garland can do, which is going to be great. And it's going to be more mobile, where we can move it around to different places of the community to take different measurements. So I just wanted to make that point too. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Larry, who's going to give a little more detail about the equipment that we discussed, and then Genevieve is going to give some details on the exercise.
Thank you. The subcommittee was asked to vote on placement of all these, all the monitors. They were, on the left are all the toxins that they will monitor. And then, so we had the trailer, which is full service, let's say, monitor equipment. And we had one of those, and then we had, then there's the van, and I think there's one, right? I have to put my glasses on. And the van will monitor everything but VOC, BTEX, no, let's see, one item, the VOC auto, and then you have two compact systems will monitor everything but the VOC auto and the toxics, and two compact systems, yeah, that's the ones that will not monitor VOC and toxics, and then the standalone PM 2.5s will monitor only PM 2.5. So we were asked to then vote upon where to place these monitors and how, you know, from trailers, vans, and compact system and standalone.
Hello everyone, Genevieve here from the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, but speaking on behalf of the Air District. So at our last meeting, we suggested having a subcommittee for air monitoring because there's a lot of information that we needed to go over. And so the Air District did set that up, and I believe everyone here got an invitation to participate, and everyone who wanted to join was invited to the subcommittee meeting. And so at this meeting, would you say there may be 30 people, 25 people showed up? Maybe 20. And so we got there, and there was a lot of information provided to us, and this is a list of what was provided. And so there is a map in front of you here, and I'm going to point to it just to share with you what we learned. So we learned where the current monitors are and what the wind direction is. And so to explain, the current monitors are the ones in the light blue markers, if you would see on like Google Maps. And the wind direction is generally going southeast. So if you are driving south on the 99 going through Fresno, that's basically the direction the wind goes through town. So it's going southeast. They also shared with us land use, and I think lots of you can already tell where residential uses are in the city. They're usually greener on this map, or should be. And then the industrial is mainly in H, I, G, and J, but also scattered a bit in D and E and that southern corner of A. They also shared with us the stationary sources of NOx emissions, and I don't exactly recall highest sources of NOx, but the stationary sources of PM 2.5, the largest one is in J, and then the second largest one is in that bottom corner of A. For stationary sources of VOCs, so those incorporate those oil and gas toxics like benzene. The largest sources of VOCs in Fresno are the bottom of I, or no, it's in K, the top of K, basically on the border between K and I. Diesel particulate exposure basically said the whole city was exposed to diesel. I think there's better data that CARB will share soon that will give us a better resolution of that. Asthma percentile, I think, was also pretty well represented across the city. Our regional air pollution doesn't discriminate, so a lot of us have asthma here in the valley. The cardiovascular rates, I believe, were more centered in the southern central part of Fresno. And then they also shared with us where the sensitive receptors are. I believe there's a map in your packet on that, but a lot of the schools are in the residential areas, right? And I will move on. So this was pictures of the meeting. We were all in different groups, and we were shared all this information so that we could then look over it, discuss, try to work out where we would want these different monitors located based on what they could monitor and where we knew the sources of pollution were. So we had little group discussions, and then we were able to share with the larger room our reasonings for where we would want different monitors placed. So we were able to share across everyone our reasonings. And then we all stood up, you can see it here, and we were given stickers based on the available monitors that the district has, and we were able to put them up on the map to show where we wanted them. And so this is actually what that map looks like. And I can start, if you look here, this is a tally of all those stickers, but I'm gonna actually be referencing the map here. So the trailer is the one that can measure everything that we can imagine, and that's the green dots. So everyone got up and put the green dots where they wanted them to be. And so the most number of green dots was put in Malaga, in J, and that's likely because there are two large, the largest source of PM is there. We know there's a lot of diesel truck traffic around there, and there's other stationary sources of pollution. And because of wind direction, all of the emissions northwest of Malaga would be coming that way. So we thought it'd be a good place to put our most sensitive monitor, because it was the seemingly most burdened by multiple sources of pollution. I believe, green is the trailer. No. Yes. The green is the trailer, and the yellow is the compact system, and we have two of those. And that can measure everything except for some VOCs related with autos, with mobile cars. And so the number one places for that were in D and K. As I said, the largest sources of VOCs is in K. And so the compact system can measure that. So I think there was consensus to put one there. And also there's a lot of land there that's zoned or going to be zoned for industrial uses, so it could perhaps help us watch emissions over time as land use changes. And then it was placed in D, which is downwind from a major source of pollution in A, and an area of concern for a lot of residents, and there's also industrial sources in that area as well, and it's close to the highway. I think those are the reasons people wanted that there. And then last, we had the PM 2.5 monitors, and so those were kind of scattered all over South Fresno. I believe that was to get good spatial information about the whole community, but also look at possible impacts from residential wood burning, which is PM 2.5, as well as diesel emissions. And then actually there's one more, which is the van. And that van has everything as well and can drive wherever we want it. And so there was general consensus that it should go down every road in every community in this area multiple times so that we can see differences among neighborhoods, but also respond to community concerns. So we can get perhaps better information about diesel emissions, perhaps better information about residential wood burning. Here in Fresno, in the valley, we're not allowed to be burning in our fireplaces on some days, and so perhaps this van could help show us where people are not abiding by the law. I would like to say we had all of this information, but we didn't get toxics information outside of those VOC, like the benzene, those kind of oil and gas related VOCs. So there's still toxics information, like the metals, that we don't know. So we weren't able to respond to that. So perhaps that's something that needs to be brought back to the committee. But before I go into my own personal or organizational comments, I'll stop. Was there anything else you wanted me to add? Yes. So this is the general consensus based on the number of dots. And so as I said, there is the trailer with everything here in Malaga, compact system here and here, and then the PM ones are these bubbles. I'd also like to note at the last meeting, there was a lot of talk about wanting a permanent station. I think that was brought up by a lot of people. And so the Air District does have a permanent monitoring station here. And so they've agreed to put a federal regulatory grade, top of the line PM 2 monitor at their permanent station in the center of this South Central community here. And so that information will be permanent and will go on to the real-time air network so that it'll be publicly accessible by everyone. So that's exciting, and it's, I believe, near the 99 in Jensen. Yes? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you, and thank you to everybody who participated in the subcommittee meeting. Right now, we're going to do an exercise as the first part of this discussion. All members of the committee should have a card at your place, and we would ask, based on what you've seen in this presentation, to write down any thoughts you might have on additional monitoring that you might like to see if more resources become available, if there are any areas where you'd like the van to focus. Please use the letters on the map. Each segment has a different letter, so please reference those. And then any other thoughts that you might have on the subcommittee's recommendation. And we would ask that only members of the committee turn in these cards, but of course we do have our written comment forms if any members of the public want to submit comments. So we will take 5 minutes and then come by and collect the cards before moving on to the next item. What we're going to do now is we're going to collect all the cards, and then district staff will tally them up, and we will come back at the end and discuss it. But before we do that, I just, 1 second, Lisa, want to see, generally speaking, if everyone feels comfortable with the recommendations from the subcommittee.
Hi, as I'm sitting here, Vanessa has a methodology question.
Yeah, it occurred to me that we looked at the maps and we made our decision about where to selectively put the trailer, the compact system, based on information that came from where the most heavily impacted places were. But if we don't have current monitoring in certain areas, where are we getting this information from and how accurate is it? And what's the origin of this information that we've used to decide where we're recommending compact system versus trailer?
Yeah, no, certainly. That's a great question. A lot of the information that was given was from a variety of different things. So a lot of it was from the emissions inventory, which is based on our source data that we get from all of those different sources. And so that's actual data that we have from those different sources of the emissions that they emit by those various pollutants. And that's something that not only have we, I think, discussed a couple of different times from Brian, but that's actually something he's going to be discussing in depth again at this meeting. But to your point, a lot of this monitoring is necessary in order to understand more of those impacts. So what we did is we took into account what we do know, so based on wind direction, based on the pollution that is being emitted from the different sources, and based on a couple of other different types of models. We passed out a map that was provided by the CalEnviroscreen tool that models impacts from diesel emissions, for example. So that was one of the maps that we used. And so all of those different things came into account, at least from what we had at the time to provide. But exactly what you're saying. We do have monitors in the area. Those are sort of what those green dots are. It's definitely more visible on the handout that John just went over, or on the map in the back. But so from all of those different sources of data, that's what we used to give to the committee to sort of help them develop their recommendations. But we 100% agree, the more monitoring, the better, and that's why we think that placing these monitors, at least initially, for a good period of time can help us understand that. And if we find, as we maybe move the van around perhaps in different areas, maybe some of these extra areas that you guys have identified, perhaps we realize maybe we were wrong, maybe there was more pollution impacts in a separate zone that we can then take a monitor that we have maybe in a less impacted zone and move it over, or should we procure more resources and add more monitors to the area, that could be the next place to get it.
And we had one more question.
So kind of as a follow-up to that, if we're looking to do the best with this limited amount of equipment, when you look down in where one of the compact system is going, and if the wind is blowing in that southwest direction, there's basically no residentials down there. So when I'm looking at this, if we want to protect the residentials, which there's schools and others in there, it seems like we should move it up into the DE areas. And when you looked at the diesel percentile and the azimuth percentile, this lower was a lighter color, meaning it was less impacted. So that was one of my concerns on that, is that maybe we're not, if we're truly trying to protect the residential areas, we should monitor by the residential areas and make sure we've got that covered.
Thank you.
Hi, I just have a quick comment. Genevieve, I thought you did a great job, but you did make a comment that I wanted to address, and you said that this monitoring was to find out who's not abiding by the law. Well, most of these guys have sources that are in compliance, and what we're looking at are the cumulative impacts. So I just think it's incorrect to say that we're trying to find people who aren't abiding by the law.
For the translator, she was referring to the wood burning rule, the residential wood burning.
I have sorry. I think one suggestion I would make, I know as we continue with subcommittee meetings, even though we did go into the weeds a lot in the first subcommittee meeting, some things are still not specific enough. Like within these regions, it's a tiny map, but this is a large area of each of these sectors. And so we still need the discussion of where exactly these monitors that are in each section are actually going to be placed, and looking at more detail of each of those sensitive receptors that are there. Or is this something that needs to be fence line monitored if it's one of the bigger emitting facilities?
Sure. And I think that's something that we can certainly do. As the first step, the committee will need to either reach a consensus or vote to formally adopt those recommendations. And once we have established the broader areas, we can focus on some of the more specific locations. So with that said, right now we have several options we can continue to discuss. We can make a motion to vote to support the subcommittee recommendations or not, or we can table this discussion until later after we've had a chance to summarize the committee's card comments. I'm going to go over here then to you, Naimeen.
I just had a question. Apologize, this has already been covered. Is there an option to deploy low-cost monitors, just blanket the city as much as we can? And the idea there is not to get an accurate measure, but to really monitor trends and could guide us as to where these regulatory level sensors could be placed. It might identify temporal behaviors and or patterns, if you will. Is that an option? I don't know who I'm asking this question to.
Yes, great question. That is an option. I think we brought that up maybe in the last presentation, that it's an option to blanket a bigger area with low-cost sensors that's not as accurate, but it could be used to try to better understand spatial differences across the community. So good feedback that could be something that we use. Yeah.
Also, some of the community groups are going to be doing that, and it will be also part, they're community groups that have been funded by CARB through this process to do some of that work. I know, is Kevin?
No, he left, but not really, Jamie, because the collective, CCAC, CBAC, CCJN, our grant is for the entire San Joaquin Valley. So because this was already a selected community, we're not deploying our low-cost sensors in the city of Fresno. We have selected, based on the recommendation of our steering committee, other communities outside of the city. But I also want to, I have two questions, one question and one comment. The question is about, wasn't that also something that we discussed briefly at our meeting last week? That one other strategy was that for the air district to purchase low-cost sensors and deploy those more, extensively, and how is that strategy going to be combined with this? And the second, I would personally prefer to table the final decision on this until we see the data on toxic air contaminants that you guys are still compiling.
Yes, I'd like to make a motion to table it so that the people that made comments, staff could review it and see if there's any other new ideas that may be able to be presented at the next meeting.
I'd just like to concur as well that we need to postpone with action, which is actually the deeper steering committee. Everyone on this in here, if you're available, it really is just an extension of what we're doing. I don't want you to think that it's anything that any of you are not capable of doing because it's hard work, but we were all able to come together and do it, but it definitely needs a little more time.
Okay, so are you seconding the motion then? The third, okay.
What are the, sorry, Larry, was it? What are the cost differences between the different monitors, including low-cost monitors? Just order of magnitude.
Sure, a low-cost sensor for PM 2.5 could cost $200. A purple air sensor, you probably heard of those. A regulatory PM 2.5 instrument can be $20,000.
How much have you spent on the monitors that represented here in each zone, the trailer, compact system?
So the whole system we have here represents about $2 million worth of investment for all the platforms, all the equipment, support equipment.
Just to further the motion that we might need to have a subcommittee on this issue, I would propose that the subcommittee be directed to develop several options that we could vote in between.
Do you want to amend the motion to include that recommendation? To have a subcommittee meeting to develop different options for consideration? Okay.
Thanks. Just as a point of clarification, have the necessary facilities and land been identified for each of these suggested locations yet, or is that going to be the next step in the process?
That is the next step. So since that takes a while to do that, all the logistics, getting in touch with landowners, working out everything, we're hoping to get some approval today to move forward with investigating some of these areas to see what might work, to try to get everything in place by July. But if the committee wants to take more time to review more information, it'll just, push the timeline forward. And we might not have things by July. It may take a little bit longer, just to consider. Thanks.
All right, so we have a motion to table this discussion until the next committee meeting and hold a subcommittee meeting in the meantime to develop different options for consideration. Does that accurately summarize the motion? Okay. All in favor, please raise your hands. Okay, so that's 19 in favor, and those opposed, please raise your hands. One. Okay, so the motion passes 19 to 1, and we will be in touch with you about further details. So next, we are going to have an update on the continuing technical assessment. Brian Clements, the Air District's Manager of Technical Services, and Alejandra Cervantes from CARB are going to be presenting.
Good evening, Brian Clements, the Technical Services Program Manager with the district, and I'll be providing an update on the stationary source emissions as part of our continued technical assessment update that we provide every meeting. So we wanted to continue to, like I said, provide status updates on the inventory and also the related website display tools. Regarding the stationary source inventory that the district compiles and sends to ARB, we're currently processing the 2018 calendar data for facilities, so we'll actually have newer information to provide later this year. Until that 2018 emissions inventory data is available, we'll continue to display the available data that we have. On our website, we're currently showing the 2013 through 2017 emissions inventory data. And just to add a couple comments on regarding toxics, currently the criteria pollutants are on the website. The toxics emissions are not displayed. That's currently in the works. We'll have that soon. And once we compile all the information along with the area and mobile source inventory, we want to have it available. And the other thing is there's some complexities about toxics that we want to make sure the information is displayed in useful information, such as how it impacts the community. So that is in the works, and we hope to have that soon. And the other thing is, based on recent feedback through the steering committee process, we want to continue to update the website mapping tool, so we heard comments on that, and we're going to show you some screenshots of what we've been working on and what we're proposing to display. So regarding the map updates that are in progress, we're adding sensitive receptor layers, and they'll be visible in some of the screenshots that I have coming up next. I'll show you that in a minute. Public and private schools will be on the map, medical and care facilities, and they'll be all intertwined with our stationary sources. You'll be able to toggle those layers on and off and get a feel for the spatial locations of all those things. We're adding layers for the different pollutants, PM 2.5, NOx, VOCs, and again, they'll be toxics. And we're also updating the facility markers based on some good comments we received, where those markers will be sized to indicate the relative magnitude of the emissions, the mass emissions. And then we plan to have, again, visual displays for toxics and mobile emissions as well. And we really like that our website to be a one-stop shop display for the mobile area and stationary source emissions. So regarding the emission totals by category, this data was presented previously based on the old boundaries, but it's the latest complete set of information that we have. Again, it's currently being updated. But to clarify what these pie charts are, each of these is the percent of emissions broken down by category, stationary, mobile, and area. And so these percentages will change when all the data is collected, and we'll update these right away when we have all that. But we wanted to, stress the importance of, keep an eye on the big picture, having these main categories visible and available at any time, so we can keep an eye on, the critical categories of pollution. And we'll hear more about the aerial and mobile source emissions from ARB in the next. So some of the map updates regarding the sensitive receptors. Right now we have and this is our kind of test version of a mock-up that we have. We have the public schools, private schools, medical facilities, the care facilities on the map. And we've begun adding other layers that you'll see as well in a second. This is a screenshot of how all those layers, when toggled on, how they'll look together. And then adding another layer here. This example is PM 2.5 emissions. It shows, some relative locations of the facilities that emit PM 2.5 compared to those receptors. And this information isn't or the screenshot is perpendicular, of course. It's more of a bird's eye view to the community, and so you still can't tell the relative magnitude of the emissions from this view, of course. We played around with larger two-dimensional circles for the higher emitting facilities, but with so many facilities on the map, it became difficult to see. So we're proposing something a little different, which is more of a three-dimensional display approach, which you can see on this slide. And again, this slide represents PM 2.5 emissions from facilities, and where the discs or cylinders in some cases that are larger than others. So those represent the proportionality of air pollution that's emitted from those sources. And then once multiple layers are toggled on like this, you'll be able to gain perspective on those amounts from facility to facility, as well as how close they are to some of those other receptors, schools, and other things. And the map will be fully functional as far as zooming in and out. These are static screenshots, of course, but you'll be able to rotate the views up, down, left, right, zoom in and out. And then finally, you'll still be also able to click on any one of those facilities. Like you can click on any one of those discs or cylinders, and there'll be a pop-up box that comes up and has information about that facility, who it is, what type of operation it is, the emissions inventory that we have available. And then this is a screenshot of the VOC emissions. Same thing for each pollutant. The height of the cylinder is relative to how much pollution that particular facility will be emitting. But again, we also want to have additional layers that we don't have available yet, such as, you know, the mobile emissions, other area source categories. And again, we plan to have toxic emissions. And so we plan to have these layers and information available soon on our website, and we'll update everybody as soon as we have that information. So this is actually the last slide I have on the mapping up and inventory updates. So I'm going to pass it to ARB to discuss the mobile and area source inventory updates.
Can I have the presentation? Hi everyone, my name is Alejandra Cervantes and I work with the Community Emission Inventory Group at the California Air Resources Board. I'm here today with my colleague Adrian Kayavyab. And I'm just here to give you guys a quick update on the development of the emission inventory. So CARB and district staff, we've been working on developing the inventory for the South Central Fresno community. And we plan to finalize in the next few weeks the numbers that we're going to show here. So please keep in mind that these numbers are not final. And we appreciate any of the feedback or input that you guys have during this process. So I'm going to focus mostly on area sources and mobile sources. So right here on this slide, we have the emission totals for the South Central Fresno community based off of the adopted boundary. And we're still currently working on the on-road mobile sources. But once we're finished, once we have finalized all the emission sources, we'll be able to provide all the criteria pollutants for all the different emission sources. Right now, we're just showing you guys PM2.5, NOx, ROG, and ammonium. From the table, area-wide is the main contributor between I believe PM 2.5, ROG, and ammonium. And then for stationary sources, we have NOx emissions. So we're still working on trying to figure out which of these area sources we're able to move from the grid scale back to where the emissions are actually occurring. And one of these examples is for commercial cooking. We're trying to see where the PM 2.5 emissions are happening and how much is being emitted. So the map right here, it shows the distribution of the PM 2.5 emissions throughout the community in a 1 kilometer grid. The red squares here show the top 40% of the emissions compared within the whole community. And here we have the breakdown of these area source categories and what are the main contributors for the community. NOx emissions, we have manufacturing and industrial and residential fuel combustion to be the main contributors. For PM 2.5, we have cooking emissions and paved road dust. And for ammonia emissions, we have farming operations and other miscellaneous processes. For farming operations, it's mostly related to the livestock husbandry, so any livestock that's being taken care of within the community. The map on the right side shows the distribution of the residential wood combustion throughout the community. And it follows the same format where the red and orange show the top percentile or location of the top percentile of the emissions. For off-road mobile sources, we're still working on moving those emissions to locations, but the map on the right here shows the diesel PM10 emissions and where in the community these would be happening. The locations are not finalized, so we're still trying to decide on which of these locations are true. However, for some of the main contributors for NOx, PM2.5, and diesel PM10 end up being trains and off-road equipment. So for on-road mobile, we're still working on it. These results are based off of the first boundary that was set up, and we're still working on expanding all of those roads onto the adopted boundary. So these are results that I believe were presented in January. So we're just kind of wanting to give you guys a refresher of kind of what that would look like. And here we have the breakdown between light-duty vehicles and heavy-duty vehicles for NOx, ROG, PM10, and diesel PM10. And one of the key points that this map represents is that the diesel PM10 emissions are very high for heavy-duty vehicles. However, I believe within the community, those VMT values are very small compared to light-duty vehicles. And another point another comment is for the final emission inventory for the on-road emissions, this will actually be split into light-duty vehicles, medium-duty vehicles, and heavy-duty vehicles. So, and that's all I have.
Again, we have about 10 minutes allocated for questions, so we will start right now.
You may have mentioned this, but I'm looking at slide number 5, where it says draft area source emissions. Where does the data come for that, and how did you figure out what the percentages were? You want me to say that again? I'm looking at slide number 5 that says draft area source emissions, and I'm wondering where the data comes to set up these charts and how you figured out what the different percentages were.
The data from the SIP inventory, it's usually done at a regional scale. So we're zoning in, and we're given regional scale totals. So we're looking into the grids or the parts of the community that have and what the emissions are specific for those locations, and then summing them up, the emissions for the community.
So this inventory will be in an online platform, right?
Yeah, once the inventory has been finalized, we will give it to the district and they will upload it into the website. Or
what about the other website that CARB is building that has all the technology? And I think that earlier in the process they were mentioning that there was going to be one website that would have everything, this and the best available retrofit technology and many other things. And if, by when is this going to be completed?
So Karen will answer that question related to the CARB side.
Thanks. So We're actually working on 3 different tools at CARB. One is to be able to have a statewide data portal for all the individual community air quality monitoring that is being done, and we're working to get that launched this summer as that data starts being collected in all the different communities. We also have an existing tool that displays emission inventory information. Right now, it is from some of the largest sources in the state, and so we're working on being able to expand that over time to also display this more individual community level data. And then the third tool is what you were talking about, Nayamin, is a clearinghouse for information on technologies for reducing emissions from all of these sources. And that will be coming online probably about a year from now. Once we have those individual ones, then our ultimate goal is to actually be able to tie them all together so that community members would have one place to go to and say, what am I breathing? What's causing it? And what can I do about it? But that's probably a couple of years down the road. But what we want to do is continue to work with all of you to say, how can it be most useful as you started using these individual tools? And especially, how do we interpret it when we start having lots of information together?
All right. So for our last presentation, Brian Clements is going to present on control of emissions for regulated sources, along with Brian Moore from CARB.
Oh, no, you're fine. I think it fell.
All right, thank you. Hi, it's me again. I'll be going over control of emissions for regulated sources in the community. And as you know, AB 617 provides some new opportunities for finding and implementing air pollution reductions at the community level. And a big part of that is the steering committee's local knowledge of the current environmental conditions, and then passing that knowledge along in this process. And so we really want to make sure that we call upon that knowledge the best we can to ensure that we're finding all opportunities for new emission reductions through the CERP process. And so to do that, this presentation is really focused on identifying the clean air efforts in the community to date in a little more detail than we previously provided, including links and where to find additional information on various programs. So we hope that, knowing a little more detail may spur on ideas for new opportunities. So first, the district has been here a while, actually decades, reducing air pollution from stationary sources under its jurisdiction. Hundreds of rules have been adopted. Many of them have been amended numerous times over the years. And each one, the requirements become more and more stringent. There's been significant reductions in the valley through all of this, which has resulted in facilities reducing emissions by 85% in the valley since 1990. But of course, there's still emission reductions to achieve, and the district is continuing these efforts to improve air quality. One of these is the required BARCT, or Best Available Retrofit Control Technology analysis under AB 617. I invite you to check out our 617 BARCT website, and there's a link here on the slides where you'll see all kinds of related information to that. There are documents and details on the approach and what's required, the approach to analyzing current rules, what rules are subject to this BARCT analysis, and then the district's expedited schedule to analyze these rules. And one of the other fronts is the recently adopted 2018 PM 2.5 plan, which demonstrates a scheduled attainment of the federal health-based PM 2.5 standards. The plan includes significant incentive-based control measures focusing on mobile sources, which remain the majority of the valley's emissions that we need to reduce to become into attainment. But the plan also does include measures to further reduce emissions from certain industrial sources. In addition, residential wood burning and commercial cooking, to name a few. A little bit more on the district rules that apply to existing stationary sources. We have source-specific rules that require emission reductions, and they're organized into categories so they're easier to find and reference. All these regulations associated with the Roman numeral that you see on the slide is a series of rules. So Regulation 4, or the 4000 series prohibitory rules, apply to specific types of facilities or equipment, and those rules minimize air pollution through various mechanisms, emission limits, or physical modifications may be necessary to facilities to reduce their emissions, or possibly other operational changes may be needed. Regulation 7 is a set of rules that focus on toxics and implement some of the state's air toxic control measures, like for chrome platers and dry cleaners. The Regulation 8 series of rules apply to fugitive PM10, like dust emissions that get stirred up from equipment in unpaved areas. And then Regulation 9 is a set of rules that applies to some things that don't trigger permitting requirements like the stationary sources do. And one of these is our indirect source review rule. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Again, please check out our website here. This is a link where you'll have access to the complete set of district rules and regulations. And so, for example, clicking on that and then diving into the Regulation 4, the 4000 series prohibitory rules, this is a list of all those rules. I know it's probably hard to see, but just to give you a feel for how many source-specific rules we have, I think there's over 90 here. These are focused on specific types of categories and equipment, and we've seen great reductions over the years from these rules, and it points at equipment such as boilers, dryers, refineries, composting facilities, animal farms, painting operations, gas stations, and so on. And then when opening up any one of those rules, the first thing you'll see is all the amendment dates that the rule has gone through over the years. These two rules here I put on the slide as an example apply to stationary engines. And as a category of air pollution have seen the requirements go through 13 amendments over the years. And as mentioned, each of these amendments are focused on improving air quality in the valley, where the pollution requirements become more and more stringent. And again, it's because of rules like this and many others like it, shown on the previous slide, that the stationary source emissions have been reduced by so much over the years. So I've been talking about mostly about existing sources here, but the district also requires new and expanding operations to go through a strict permit application process. The process may culminate with the issuance of a permit with enforceable conditions, but that's after going through this process that I'll describe. So one of the main mechanisms the district uses to minimize emissions from new and expanding sources to the maximum extent possible is Rule 2201, our new source review rule. And the primary component of that is best available control technology, which is required for new and expanding operations. And best available control technology, or BACT for short, is exactly what it says there. It's the best controls that are available, technologically feasible, and if they've been implemented anywhere, they're absolutely required. We also assure no violations of ambient air quality standards will occur from a new project, as well as assuring no new health risks will be created as a result of the proposed project. And finally, larger stationary source projects require a public noticing process and an associated public comment period. And then again, if performing that analysis, if any of these requirements aren't met, the permit won't be issued. We'll continue to either work with the facility so that they can make changes, their proposals to reduce emissions, or we just won't, finalize and approve that project. Regarding air toxics, the district uses several mechanisms that when combined, we refer to it as our integrated air toxics air toxics program for the valley. And some of those rules I already mentioned, such as the new source review and our prohibitory rules, including some of the toxics rules. The district also implements federal and state requirements, where these requirements, such as MACT requirements and NESHAP requirements and the state ATCM requirements, end up as enforceable permit conditions on stationary sources. And then also, in addition to these, the district implements the state's AB 2588 program, which is the air toxic hotspots program. And under this regulation, stationary sources are required to report substances, so the types of substances they emit and the quantities of those substances that are emitted as air pollution in order for us to determine local health risks. The regulation is also a public right to know regulation. It's meant to also inform the local residents of any existing significant health risks. And then also it requires the reduction of significant health risks to acceptable levels. And then finally, one of the most effective methods at reducing air pollution and toxics has been through the district's incentive grant programs. Most clean air projects, even fireplace retrofits and especially diesel engine replacements, reduce both criteria and air toxic contaminants. As mentioned, the district grant programs have been key and will continue to be key in achieving reductions, including mobile source reductions. Most of these programs are aimed at replacing older, higher emitting equipment with newer, cleaner technologies. Many of our programs have been open and available for years and continue to be available. We've put some example of our programs on the slide, which are split into 3 general categories: grants aimed at businesses, public agencies, and the public or residential. And there's also some pictures here as an example. I see someone very happy to be receiving their brand new electric vehicle, their new Leaf there. But for more information on these programs, you're invited to visit the grants website there, shown on the slide as well. And then in addition to all that, there are still a few more ways to achieve emission reductions from mobile sources. Now the district can't regulate tailpipe emissions directly per se, but we've made extensive efforts to find ways to get emission reductions from mobile sources. One being the district's ISR rule, or indirect source review rule, that was first adopted in 2005. It's the first and only rule in the nation that requires reductions in emissions from new developments, which is based on a fleet average or at the project level. We've also created a voluntary emission reduction agreement, or VERA program, where developers can enter a contract with the district. And under these VERAs, developers provide mitigation funds to the district, where we then in turn fund clean air projects on behalf of the developer. The district has an E-trip regulation that requires large employers to implement alternative transportation measures, such as carpooling. And finally, while the district doesn't have any land use authority as far as siting or any decisions on where development should go, the district does provide comments to the public agencies that have those authorities, or lead agencies under CEQA. And so we provide comments on those projects, hundreds of comments a year, informing them and subsequently the land developers about district regulations such as ISR, our dust control rules, our permitting rules, and other opportunities to improve air quality, like the VERAs that I mentioned. And so that concludes the presentation. I'll pass it to Brian Moore at ARB to provide the state's perspective on the emission controls.
Well, thank you all for hanging in there. It's always fun to give the last presentation on a weeknight after a 2-hour meeting. So I hope I can offer up some, thank you. Save that for afterwards. You may want to wait. Like Brian Clements mentioned, so I work for the California Air Resources Board. So we're the state organization, also known as CARB, or you may hear say ARB, that regulates emissions on a statewide level. So through this presentation, I'm going to try to highlight the current state strategies that can help reduce emissions in communities, as well as what we're planning to do through the AB 617 process and beyond in the future with regards to reductions. And a little background on my role. So I'm the community contact for Fresno. So my main job is coordinating what we do at the state, with what the district does with Brian, what I do with people that work at other state agencies like Heather at OWEHA, we talk, and then also with community-based organizations in the group. So I would say I know a good amount about almost every facet of 617, but I'm not an expert in any of them. But I know the experts, so please, afterwards, ask me questions. If I can't answer them, I will contact with the area expert. Some of them are actually in this room right now. We have monitoring and inventory. So please bring on the questions, and I apologize if I can't answer them right away. Cool. So just a brief background on how air pollution regulation works. We have 3 main public agencies. The first is the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and as this figure kind of shows, they're really in charge of regulating like trains, ocean-going vessels, and planes as far as their emissions. Also, these ambient air quality standards we're all trying to achieve, the U.S. EPA sets those. So when you hear NAAQS or ambient air quality standards, the U.S. EPA is setting those. We move down to the state level, that would be us at CARB. So in general, and there are some exceptions, we regulate things that move. So like cars, buses, and trucks is kind of our purview across the state. And moving down even more granularly, we have the local air districts, like the meeting you're at here now in San Joaquin Valley, and they are generally in charge of the stationary sources, so like factories, refineries, residential wood stoves, things like that. There are some exceptions which I'll get into in a sec. So at the state level, talking about what we're currently doing, and just, by the way, I tried to pick ones that applied to South Central Fresno, but in your Appendix D of the blueprint, it lists out, it's a pretty comprehensive list of our existing regulations. So you can check that out. And you could see from this graph that our regulations fall in like 5 main buckets for brevity, and since we're in Fresno, I was gonna skip ports, but if anybody is interested in port regulations, we can go there afterwards. One of the first ones is rail, and this is a good example of an exception. Now, we may not regulate the actual locomotive that the EPA does, but we do regulate a lot of the cargo handling equipment. So like the forklifts, at the rail yards, so this could be interesting, like, the Kawa rail yard, just south of Kawa. So like the forklifts there, the yard trucks, all that kind of stuff, we do regulate the emissions of. Another thing that applies to rail, the drayage trucks. So the trucks that make small trips from like the rail yard to a close warehouse, usually those are sometimes the older, more polluting trucks because they're not reliable for those long hauls. So they become these trucks that do these short trips. So we can regulate emissions coming out of those. Mobile. So yeah, we are the main, as of today, we can set tailpipe emissions in California by ourselves, not the US EPA. Those kind of manifest themselves in like the truss and buck regulations. So if you heard of like replacing or retrofitting, or these big heavy duty trucks and buses having to put on filters for PM, That's what this regulation entails. Also, heavy-duty vehicle inspection programs. So we will check to see if there's any signs of tampering or obvious big-time emitters, like the black smoke that was shown in Heather slide coming out, visual inspections. We can do that at like border crossings a lot, or those highway patrol, way stations. We can do at the fleet facilities where these trucks are, we can do inspections. And then also those stop checks like along the road you may see where a highway patrolman's helping to pulling over trucks, and we have some inspectors there. Another example of mobile on-road is the idling control measures we see. So we have some at schools and some in general. If a truck is close to a sensitive receptor, like a hospital or a playground or something like that, they will not be able to idle that truck. I think it's 5 minutes, and they have to shut it off. Around a school, that engine has to be off. So that's some of the stuff we do as far as on-road emissions. Off-road. So we're talking about off-road. Hello? Hello? Is that better? Jeff, you're acting like you understood. You're getting everything. Were you just shaking your head to me? Okay. Sorry. I can go back over stuff if anybody has questions. But on the off-road side, we look at mobile. A big spot is like those transportation refrigeration units. So you see a truck that's carrying something that has to be cold. They'll have an ancillary engine that helps cool the truck. Or maybe if it's around Christmas time, stores may have excess cargo containers sitting out in like their parking lot that need to be cooled. Those can run on diesel, so we regulate emissions from those. The next category down in the light blue, the off-road, this would be like your construction equipment and things like that we do regulate emissions from. And small off-road engines, so these are considered under 25 horsepower, so this is like your lawn and garden equipment that is gas-powered. We also write regulations for. And the final category, and this is kind of an exception, we do have some authority to regulate toxics, which I know is an interest in this community. So through the Hotspots program that Brian mentioned, and actually in conjunction with OEHA, where Heather works, CARB is required to look at substances and determine whether or not they are toxics. They're called toxic air contaminants. So it's a program that we go through on an annual to semi-annual basis, just evaluating new substances of interest that may be toxic. And if CARB decides that a substance is toxic, we are then tasked with evaluating if it needs to be controlled and if we can control it. I mean, work with the air districts a lot on those. So an example of that is our chrome plating measure. It's an air toxic control measure that CARB has instilled. Another example is diesel PM is considered a toxic. So we can regulate diesel PM through our mobile regulations, but then also it is an air toxic. And the final one, composite wood, is another example. So that's like formaldehyde coming from particle board and some adhesives. It is considered a toxic, so then we have the authority to regulate that. Cool. Next, this is just some air quality data I was going to show you. So this is on the statewide level, looking back historically. So this is on the y-axis, we have increased cancer risk. So this is just what Heather was also talking about. So exposure to, in this case, diesel PM in those black lines, how much increased cancer risk did we see statewide? And you can see that it has been decreasing, which is good, but what size do we want that increased cancer risk to be? We want no bars on this graph eventually, right? And this statewide data doesn't denote hotspots in communities, right? This is just looking at the state as a whole. And then the kind of goldish brown line is the 6 really prominent toxic air contaminants that we have also measured and looking at their progress over time. So we're making some progress, but we'd like to see this be a blank figure in the future. Some more historical data, and again we have the years across the X, and we have the average amount of black carbon on the Y-axis. And what black carbon is, it's that light absorbing stuff, soot, coming out of those diesel trucks. And again, Heather showed that great picture of the black smoke bellowing out. That's black carbon. And it also can come from coal burning and some wood burning. So that's something we'd like to control. And so far since the 60s, it has gotten better. I remember when I was a kid, you would routinely see a truck with the black smoke coming out when they accelerated. And you don't see that as much anymore, which is good. Or, I mean, I don't think on my trip down I saw it one, but every once in a while you will see a gross polluter out there. Next, PM 2.5 is also a big concern. through the steering committee meetings that we have heard. So this is showing historical data going back to around 98 when we started measuring for PM 2.5. And on the y-axis, we have the annual average, right? So you can see we have made progress. Oh, and this, I grabbed Fresno County data for this. So we're getting a little more specific. If any of you are interested in knowing this data is all publicly available, I can show you where you can grab that off our site or help you have access to it if you want to look at it yourself. And so what we see here, also that dotted line, so that's that ambient air quality standard of 12, right? So annual exposure of 12, we're approaching that, but we're still above it in Fresno County. So moving on to the new stuff. So what we are hoping to do in the future to improve emissions. CARB has recently passed about 5 different comprehensive plans regarding emissions controls. And these 2 in red right here, these have to do with mobile sources, which was that one bucket I mentioned. The green ones are mobile source strategy, so that's trying to limit emissions from light-duty cars and trucks, as well as heavy-duty vehicles, and transitioning to low or even like zero-emission vehicles is what this strategy depicts. The middle one, the red one, that's kind of a interagency plan. It's our freight strategy, and the idea is to work with people like Caltrans and the California Energy Commission and a lot of other groups to develop an integrated, efficient, low-emission freight plan throughout the state. So those 2 should attack things on the mobile side. These 2 plans actually are focused on climate change, so global warming pollutants. The one in the top right corner would be our short-lived climate pollutant plan. So those are things that definitely have a global warming potential, but they come out of the air really quick. So things like refrigerants, you know, from your hydrofluorocarbons for like your refrigerators and freezers, those types of gases, as well as like black carbon is a big one. And the bottom left one is our scoping plan, which focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors. And a lot of those, when you cause combustion to create greenhouse gases, you're also producing a lot of those criteria pollutants like PM that have health effects. So these programs should also tamp down those pollutants that are also dangerous to health. And finally, the one you're all familiar with, our blueprint. So that's what why we're here now, is the passage of the blueprint this past September. Sorry, I'll get through these pretty quick. Almost there. Well, we can go through these quick. Just to give you an idea when these are coming into effect, and I put this handout that has links, and this is also available digitally. If you want to link to these, you can see when these rules are going to be in effect. This just gives you an idea on on-road mobile sources, the different plans we have in store that we're trying to implement. A lot of these are either new plans or where we're making amendments, making current strategies stricter. An interesting one that's going to be discussed publicly soon that you could comment on, that last bottom one, the zero-emission drayage trucks, that's the idea of getting all those short-haul trucks zero emissions, so all electric. Another really neat plan on the table is that advanced clean trucks, so short-haul trucks that are going like UPS trucks or delivery trucks that are staying local, they're like a perfect platform to try to electrify because they're not going on huge trips, they're not carrying huge loads, so that might be a neat first area to attack and test out zero-emission vehicles. So that's also coming up. And on the off-road side, we are also looking at tightening up restrictions on cargo handling equipment, like at rail yards, going zero emission with all those gantry cranes and forklifts, things like that. And we're also looking at reducing idling at rail yards, seeing if we can reduce at transfer stations and things like that, getting locomotives to reduce their idling times. And finally, when we talk about toxics, we are thinking of amending our chrome plating amendment. So a lot of the suppressants they use to reduce emissions from chrome plating of the bass, some of that stuff isn't the best for you either. So we're looking at finding safer alternatives for our emission controls with chrome plating. We're also going to probably tighten up our restrictions on wood products, so the formaldehyde that's used as an adhesive in a lot of the particle board types of pieces of wood you can buy for construction. And then finally, we're looking at developing control measure for cooking, a suggested kind of like model rule that districts can implement once we do some more research on PM and the VOCs coming from commercial cooking. And with a lot of these, we haven't set a board date, but they're going to be considered in the near future. And again, thank you for your time. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions about the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. We are running a little bit behind schedule, so we're going to hold questions. Brian and Brian will be available after the meeting, and of course, if you want, you can always submit a question by email. So just to wrap up and discuss next steps, based on the motion that was approved, we will get in touch with you soon regarding the subcommittee meeting. And then we're going to take all of the comments that we received on the cards and summarize those in a document that we'll then distribute to the committee members. Also, all of the materials that were provided at the last subcommittee meeting, all the maps and the worksheet that Genevieve and Larry talked about, are available on the website. So if you're interested, please do go and take a look at those. Jamie, did you have a comment?
3 quick announcements. First of all, someone on Facebook Live asked about burning trash. Burning trash is always illegal. If you see someone burning trash, give us a call. Locally, it's 559-230-6000. I don't remember our complaint number right off the top. About the number. I'll just slow down in general. The phone number, call us, is 559-230-6000, or go to valleyair.org. Announcement number 2, we're also going to send out information about how kids can become members here at the Boys and Girls Club. It will open up some of the things that they can do in the evenings, and it's also just a great resource for this community, so we'll be sending out information about that. Finally, a new school bus, hopefully, was delivered today to Fowler Unified. It's all electric, and we hope to have an event. You all will hear about it. May 28th, a press event and a little celebration with the kids at Malaga Elementary. That's all tentative, but we hope to firm that up in the next week, and we'll email everyone about that. And if you'd like to come and attend and check out an electric school bus, that's one of the things that we had discussed a little bit way back at the beginning. So appreciate everyone, and that's my 3 announcements.
Thank you. And then last, there's some more work that needs to be done to develop the SERP, and so we're looking to hold an additional steering committee meeting this month, as well as June and July, and we'll look at tentative dates for those at a future meeting. But right now we're considering May 22nd, which is a Wednesday, or May 30th, which is a Thursday, and wanted to just see a quick show of hands for each option to find out which works best. And if you don't know, then you can always email us as well and let us know. So May 22nd or the 30th? Sorry. The 30th is a Thursday, yes. Wednesday the 22nd. So if you would prefer Wednesday the 22nd, just a quick show of hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so 8. So I counted 8 in favor of the 22nd, and how about the 30th? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So I count 11 for the 30th. So we'll be in touch with those details. And of course, about the subcommittee meeting as well. So now, last item, we're going to move to public comment. So if you'd like to speak, Cody has the microphone. And again, please keep your comments to 2 minutes if possible. All right, it looks like we do not have any public comments this evening. So with that, we will adjourn, and thank you all very much for your time tonight.